Los Angeles, California, October 1954, 9:23 p.m. The restaurant is Romanoff's, the most important table in Hollywood. The place where the industry comes to see and be seen, and to understand, without anyone saying it directly, exactly where the power lies at any given moment. Frank Sinatra is at his usual table, the one by the window, the one that has been his table for 5 years, the one that the maitre d' holds for him regardless of reservations, regardless of who else has asked, regardless of anything except the simple fact that this is Frank's table and Frank's Hollywood and Frank's town. And then the door opens. Marlon Brando walks in. He is not dressed for Romanoff's. He is wearing jeans and a plain white t-shirt. His hair is uncombed. He looks like a man who has wandered in from a construction site, except that his face is the most famous face in America, and his posture carries the kind of authority that expensive suits cannot manufacture. The room goes quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when two forces of nature occupy the same space. Frank Sinatra looks at Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando looks at Frank Sinatra. And in that silence, that 10-second silence in the most important restaurant in Hollywood, the war that would define an era of American entertainment begins. Not with words, not yet. With the simple, devastating question of who would look away first. Neither of them did. To understand the war between Frank Sinatra and Marlon Brando, you have to understand what they represented. They were not simply two famous men who disliked each other. They were two fundamentally different ideas about what it meant to be a man, what it meant to be an artist, and what it meant to hold power in the most powerful entertainment industry on earth. Frank Sinatra was the old order. Not old in years. He was 38 in 1954, at the absolute peak of his restored power, but old in philosophy. Frank believed in craft, in preparation, in the discipline of showing up on time, knowing your lines, delivering the performance cleanly and efficiently, and then going home. He believed that professionalism was a form of respect for the director, for the crew, for the audience who had paid their money and deserved the best you could give them on the first take. Frank did not believe in rehearsing. He did not believe in multiple takes. He did not believe in sitting in a trailer for 3 hours finding your character's emotional truth. He believed in walking onto the set, opening his mouth, and giving you something that no amount of preparation could produce. The raw, immediate electricity of a man completely alive in the present moment. This was not laziness. This was philosophy. Frank believed that the first take was always the best take because it was the most honest. Before the actor started thinking too hard, before self-consciousness crept in, before the performance became a performance rather than a truth. Marlon Brando was the new order. He had studied with Stella Adler. He had absorbed the method, the approach to acting developed by Konstantin Stanislavski and transformed for American stages and screens by Lee Strasberg in the Actors Studio. The method required total psychological immersion in a character. It required that the actor not perform emotion, but actually feel it. It required preparation, introspection, and the kind of deep internal excavation that Frank Sinatra found not just unnecessary, but actively embarrassing. Brando had proven what the method could do. In A Streetcar Named Desire in 1951, he had delivered a performance that redefined what American acting was capable of. In The Wild One in 1953, he had created an archetype that would influence popular culture for decades. In On the Waterfront in 1954, the same year as that night at Romanoff's, he had given what many critics still consider the greatest screen performance in American history. Frank Sinatra had his Oscar. Marlon Brando had his Revolution. And revolutions, by their nature, do not coexist comfortably with the orders they replace. The professional collision came first. In 1954, the film version of Guys and Dolls was in development at MGM. It was one of the most successful Broadway musicals in history, a perfect vehicle, on paper, for Frank Sinatra, who had been attached to the project almost from the beginning. Frank was to play Sky Masterson, the lead role, the gambler with the golden voice who bet everything on love. And then Samuel Goldwyn, who was producing the film, cast Marlon Brando as Sky Masterson. Frank Sinatra was moved to the supporting role of Nathan Detroit. The official reasoning was commercial. Brando was the biggest star in Hollywood at that moment, and Goldwyn wanted the biggest star. The practical reasoning was more complicated. Goldwyn believed that a musical needed its lead to commit fully to the singing and dancing requirements, and he was less certain that Brando, who had never done a musical, would deliver than he was that Frank would. He was wrong about Brando, who worked obsessively to prepare his vocals. And he was catastrophically wrong about the effect the casting decision would have on the set. Frank arrived on the first day of production with the kind of controlled fury that was more dangerous than any explosion. He was professional. He was punctual. He knew every line, every lyric, every blocking note. And he absolutely refused to do more than one take of anything. This would have been acceptable, even impressive, if his scenes had not increasingly involved Marlon Brando on the other side of the camera. Brando's process required multiple takes. Brando's process required that he find something new in each repetition, that he discover the character through the doing rather than bring a finished performance to the first attempt. Brando would do 10 takes, 20 takes, exploring, discarding, searching. For Frank, every additional take after the first was a small insult, a suggestion that his first instinct had been wrong, a demand that he manufacture feeling rather than simply have it. "He's the type of guy that, when he dies," Frank told reporters during the production, in a quote that became instantly famous, "he's going to give God a hard time for making him bald." The contempt was total. The filming of Guys and Dolls became one of the most famously miserable productions in Hollywood history. Two men in the same frame, neither looking at the other, both delivering performances of such determined excellence that the film worked despite the hatred radiating between them. The personal war was more complex and more interesting than the professional one. Frank and Marlon moved in overlapping social worlds. Hollywood was not large enough to avoid each other entirely, and both men were too central to the industry's social life to simply withdraw. They appeared at the same parties, ate at the same restaurants, knew the same people. What emerged was a cold war of status and positioning that the entire industry watched with the particular fascination reserved for conflicts where everyone has chosen a side. Frank's side was the Rat Pack: Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop. The tuxedos, the whiskey, the Vegas shows, the casual masculine elegance that said power was something you wore lightly because you had so much of it. Brando's side was the actors' studio crowd: James Dean, Montgomery Clift, the serious young men who believed that acting was the most important thing in the world, and that anyone who disagreed simply hadn't understood what acting was. Frank called them the mumblers. He said it publicly, repeatedly, with the particular contempt of a man who had spent 30 years learning to communicate with perfect clarity and found the fashionable pursuit of obscurity genuinely baffling. "I don't buy this actor studio stuff," Frank told an interviewer in 1957. "There's no mystery to acting. You learn the lines, you show up, you do it. The rest is just people making themselves feel important." Brando's response was characteristically oblique. He didn't engage directly. He didn't trade quotes with Frank in the press. He simply continued making films that dismantled every assumption Frank had about what screen acting was. And he continued doing it with a complete indifference to Frank's opinion that was more devastating than any direct response could have been. Because indifference from Marlon Brando was the most insulting thing he could offer. Frank Sinatra needed to matter. It was the engine of everything he did. The performances, the friendships, the feuds, the loyalty, and the cruelty. He needed to be the most important person in any room he entered. This was not vanity. It was something deeper and more fundamental. The need of a kid from Hoboken to prove, continuously and completely, that he deserved to be there. Marlon Brando simply did not care whether Frank Sinatra thought he deserved to be there. This was the thing Frank could not forgive. The war escalated in 1972 in a way that neither man had anticipated. Francis Ford Coppola was making The Godfather. The role of Don Vito Corleone, the patriarch, the man of power and quiet authority, whose voice alone could move mountains, was, by many accounts, the greatest role in the script. Frank Sinatra wanted it. He pursued it with the same desperate intensity that had won him from here to eternity. The phone calls, the meetings, the leveraging of every relationship he had built over 30 years in Hollywood. He was convinced the role was his. The character was Italian-American. The character was a man of power. The character was, in ways that Frank understood in his bones, the kind of man Frank had always believed himself to be. Coppola cast Marlon Brando. The decision was not primarily about Frank versus Marlon. It was about Coppola's vision of the film, about what the role required, about the specific quality of contained, dangerous authority that Brando had demonstrated he could carry. But in Hollywood, where every decision is personal, the effect was the same. Frank Sinatra lost the role of Don Corleone to Marlon Brando. The Godfather won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Marlon Brando won the Academy Award for Best Actor. And then, in the most theatrical act of defiance in Oscar history, sent a Native American activist named Sacheen Littlefeather to refuse the award on his behalf, citing Hollywood's treatment of Native Americans. Frank Sinatra, watching from his seat in the Chandler Pavilion, said something to the person beside him that has been repeated in Hollywood ever since. He said it quietly, in the particular voice he used when he was most furious, which was almost inaudible. What he said cannot be printed in polite company. What it communicated was total. The war never formally ended. There was no reconciliation scene, no moment of mutual respect acknowledged publicly, no late-career interview in which either man said generous things about the other. Hollywood is full of stories about old enemies making peace, and this is not one of them. What happened instead was something more honest. The world changed around them in ways that made their particular war seem, eventually, like a conflict from another century. The Hollywood they had fought over, the Hollywood of studio contracts and Romanoff's tables, and the specific social hierarchies of 1950s Los Angeles, was dismantled by the 1970s. The new Hollywood that replaced it was Coppola's Hollywood, Scorsese's Hollywood, a director's medium rather than a star's medium, where the old rules of power and status no longer applied in the ways they once had. Frank Sinatra adapted, as he always had, by retreating to the concert stage, where he was unambiguously supreme and where no one could cast Marlon Brando in his role. His final decades were defined by the voice, by the Las Vegas performances, by the world tour that demonstrated that whatever Hollywood thought of him, the audience never stopped coming. Marlon Brando adapted less successfully. His later career was marked by a deliberate refusal to do what the industry wanted, by weight gain that he acknowledged and didn't apologize for, by the withdrawal from the competitive machinery of Hollywood into a private life on a Tahitian island that he found more honest than anything the industry had to offer. They died 3 years apart. Brando in 2004 at 80, Sinatra in 1998 at 82. Hollywood buried them both with the kind of retrospective reverence it reserves for people it argued with while they were alive. The eulogies were generous. The assessments were careful. Everyone agreed that both men had been extraordinary, that their contributions had been permanent, that the medium was richer for having contained them. Nobody mentioned that they had hated each other for 40 years. Nobody needed to. What the war between Frank Sinatra and Marlon Brando actually was, beneath the professional rivalry, beneath the ego, beneath the specific Hollywood politics of who got which table at Romanoff's, was an argument about the nature of truth in art. Frank believed truth was immediate. It was the first take. It was the unguarded moment before thought got in the way. It was the voice, raw and present and entirely itself, doing what it did because that was what it did. Brando believed truth was excavated. It was found through repetition, through failure, through the willingness to look foolish in pursuit of something genuine. It required patience and introspection and the courage to be wrong many times before being right once. Both of them were correct. This is the thing that neither of them could admit, and that history has confirmed, that their opposing philosophies produced results of equal and permanent brilliance through methods that were genuinely irreconcilable. Frank Sinatra's first takes are still the standard against which vocal performance is measured. Marlon Brando's excavations are still the standard against which screen acting is measured. Two men, one Hollywood. Two truths that could not share a table. Romanoff's closed in 1962. The table by the window is gone. But the argument about craft and instinct, about preparation and presence, about what it means to be genuinely alive in front of an audience, continues in every acting class, every recording studio, every set where someone has to decide whether to do it again or trust what just happened. Frank would say, trust it. Brando would say, do it again. And somewhere in the distance between those two answers lives everything that American performance has ever been.